Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a very particular kind of world. Not the castles of Europe this time, not the unfortunate inbred Habsburgs with their famously uncooperative jaws, but somewhere far more elegant, and yet quietly tragic. Let's settle in, dim the lights, and wander into the floating world of Edo period Japan. A place where beauty was purchased, refinement was performed, and entire lives could be spent inside streets that were designed to never quite let you leave. We're going to drift through the story of the Oiran, the high-ranking courtesans of Japan. And while the word itself sometimes gets muddled in modern media, the lives of these women were nothing like the shimmering fantasies of painted screens. They were structured, ritualized, and burdened with expectation. Their tragedy lay not in chaos, but in perfection pressed so tightly it became suffocating. Now, unlike the European monarchs we usually discuss, whose biggest concerns often involved petty insults about each other's facial hair, the Oiran occupied a very different position in society. They weren't noble, but they weren't ordinary either. They lived in the yukaku, or licensed pleasure quarters, where they were both imprisoned and exalted, like rare birds, admired for their feathers, but never free to fly. So let's drift inside their world and see what that really meant. The Oiran first emerged in the 1600s, during the Edo period, when the Tokugawa shogunate decided to tidy up the more chaotic aspects of urban life. And in typical bureaucratic fashion, they didn't exactly abolish prostitution. Instead, they legalized and controlled it, because of course they did. They created designated districts in major cities, most famously Yoshiwara in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, where the entire business of sex, art, and entertainment could be regulated. Behind its gates, there were tea houses, brothels, theaters, and an entire economy built around fantasy. But the Oiran weren't just prostitutes, at least not in the blunt sense. They were elite entertainers. To be considered for such a role, a woman needed to be extraordinarily beautiful, exceptionally educated, and trained in the arts of conversation, poetry, calligraphy, dance, and music. Think of it as a very polite, very rigid audition that lasted your whole life. The tragedy begins, of course, with how these women entered the profession. Many were sold into brothels by impoverished families, sometimes as children, sometimes as a last desperate resort when there were too many mouths to feed. A contract was signed, debts were created, and the child was effectively raised inside the pleasure quarters. Training began early. Little girls were groomed not for independence, but for display. By the time one became an Oiran, she was a manufactured product of grace. Every movement was studied, every gesture rehearsed. Even her laughter had to fit the role. Soft, poised, never too eager. Imagine trying to be perfect while wearing a dozen pounds of silk and a wig decorated with hair ornaments that could double as small weapons. The most senior Oiran, the tayu, were dazzling celebrities. They could command enormous fees, entertain samurai, wealthy merchants, and sometimes even daimyo. But their fame was also their cage. Leaving the licensed district was nearly impossible. Even the great parades, where an Oiran would walk slowly through the streets on impossibly high clogs, weren't about freedom. They were advertisements, like a moving billboard of silk, lacquer, and exhaustion. And here's where the irony seeps in. These women were admired as the pinnacle of feminine refinement. Men wrote poetry about their beauty, painted portraits of their elegance, whispered about their unattainable grace. But behind the layers of brocade, the life expectancy of an Oiran was heartbreakingly short. The average age at death for courtesans was shockingly low. Disease, stress, and despair were constant companions. It was, in many ways, an exquisite, gilded cage. Now, let's float a little closer into the daily rhythm of an Oiran's life. Her morning would begin not with sunlight streaming through windows, but with attendants arranging her into layers of clothing so complex that dressing could take hours. Her hair was combed, oiled, and stacked into elaborate shapes, each ornament symbolizing rank and style. This was not comfort, it was costume. And once dressed, there was no such thing as relaxing. Appointments were scheduled. A client might spend days or weeks negotiating access. Unlike lower-ranking courtesans, the Oiran did not simply wait in smoky rooms for customers. They received them in carefully staged encounters, full of conversation, music, poetry recitations, and ceremonial drinking. The expectation wasn't simply physical pleasure, but intellectual companionship. In theory, this elevated them above ordinary sex work. In reality, it made their exhaustion all the heavier. One client might want to hear a new poem. Another might demand endless cups of sake. Another might insist on playing a game of wit where failure wasn't an option. And of course, refusal was rarely possible. Even the infamous Oiran dochu, the ritualized parade, was its own kind of torment. The courtesan would walk slowly, step by step, on towering clogs while her attendants followed in carefully rehearsed choreography. It was spectacle as labor, grace as suffering. And here's the detail that rarely makes it into the romanticized paintings. Those clogs could be over a foot high, and the walk was so slow, so excruciating, that it was less like a stroll and more like a public endurance test disguised as elegance. But perhaps the deepest tragedy wasn't the physical burden, it was the illusion of choice. The Oiran were often portrayed in literature as women of wit and autonomy, clever, sharp-tongued, able to turn away clients if they chose. In practice, very few had such power. Their debts to the brothels were crushing, their contracts binding. Even the most famous could not simply leave. And marriage, that supposed escape, was its own cruel trick. A wealthy patron might buy out an Oiran's contract, freeing her from the brothel, but she rarely entered into true equality. She became a concubine, or an ornament in a wealthy household, still admired, still constrained, still performing. Freedom was less a door and more a narrow window that almost always closed before one could reach it. And yet, within this tragedy, there was artistry. The Oiran shaped fashion, poetry, and even the language of the Edo period. Their speech, elegant and witty, influenced how women were expected to converse. Their clothing styles trickled down into popular trends. Their presence gave rise to an entire floating world culture, immortalized in woodblock prints. In other words, they were trapped, but they defined beauty for an age. So, as we drift toward the end of this meandering thought, let's hold that contrast. The Oiran lived lives of spectacle, refinement, and elegance, and yet behind the silk curtains lay a story of confinement, exhaustion, and brief, flickering celebrity. Admired, but rarely happy. Famous, but often forgotten. Painted into eternity, but living lives cut tragically short. In a way, their story isn't all that different from some of the royals we've talked about before. Power, prestige, and perfection, with a heavy price attached. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, you might picture one of those grand processions in Edo's Yoshiwara, a woman walking slowly on impossible shoes, robes trailing behind her, attendants carrying lanterns. She is beautiful, she is poised, she is, in every sense, trapped. But for a fleeting moment, as the lanterns flicker, she seems to glide. And that, let's let the Oiran drift back into the floating world, leaving us here in the quiet. Good night.